Crockett storms into a live hearing and takes direct aim at Speaker Mike Johnson over one of the most explosive issues in modern politics: the investigation into hidden budgets and unchecked power at the heart of the House. Johnson tries to humiliate her, weaponizing status and control, but just minutes later, Crockett detonates the room with hard evidence that rips through every defense he built. The chamber erupts. Mike Johnson freezes. Millions watch as the illusion of authority shatters. When the truth finally comes out, can those who abuse their power still hold on to it? Or is this where it all begins to fall apart? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The air inside the Capitol hearing chamber was razor sharp, tense enough to snap. Every camera was locked in place, every pen poised like a dagger, and every seat had been filled long before the official start time. This wasn't just another hearing. This was a televised spectacle, a carefully staged battlefield draped in red, white, and loaded intentions. The subject line read like bland procedure: inquiry into unexplained budget allocations and the scope of the Speaker's authority. But everyone knew what it really was: a high-stakes confrontation, with Jasmine Crockett cast as the inconvenient truth-teller and Mike Johnson as the empire she was about to offend. Yet when she walked in, there was no gravitas afforded to her. No reporters swarmed. No colleagues stood in solidarity. Instead, an aide pointed wordlessly to the final seat at the end of the mahogany table, miles from the main mic, boxed in by shadows and procedural coldness. Her nameplate was misspelled. Crockett sat down slowly, her fingers grazing the folder in front of her like it contained a live grenade. Across the room, Republicans chuckled among themselves, loud enough for the mics to catch it, subtle enough to deny if pressed. She didn't flinch, but the air around her felt heavier, like even oxygen had been rigged against her. Then the room shifted. A staffer flung open the double doors and in walked Speaker Mike Johnson, flanked by aides drowning in applause. His suit was crisp, his stride rehearsed, his smile dripping with the comfort of unchecked power. The Republicans rose to their feet, clapping like it was the coronation of a king, not the entrance of a man under scrutiny. Johnson didn't acknowledge Jasmine. He didn't need to. His message was already loud. "This is my room, and you're just lucky they let you sit down." The applause had barely faded when Jasmine Crockett was given the floor, but what came next wasn't a debate. It was a public execution dressed as procedure. Jasmine leaned forward, hands steady, voice calm, her folder barely open. "Mr. Chairman, as we begin reviewing Section 4B of the..." And that was as far as she got. 6 words. Just 6. That's when Mike Johnson's gavel hit the desk, not as a signal for order, but as a warning shot. "Hold it," he barked, not even looking directly at her. "Before the Congresswoman from Texas launches another TikTok rant, let's remind ourselves this is a hearing, not a content farm." The room chuckled. Laughter rippled from the Republican side like a coordinated strike, polished and poisonous. Johnson leaned back in his chair, theatrical and smug. "We're here to discuss federal appropriations, not rack up followers on social media." And just like that, the attack escalated. "This chamber requires more than rehearsed hashtags and political cosplay," Johnson continued, his words as deliberate as they were cruel. "What we need are lawmakers who actually understand the federal ledger, not influencers playing dress-up with a budget binder." He gestured mockingly in Jasmine's direction, never using her name, only titles like the gentlewoman, as if her identity itself was unworthy of acknowledgement. "Some of us built careers on law and governance. Others," he sneered, "on viral moments and stunt performances." Staffers behind him snickered. The smirk never left his face. The message was clear. "You don't belong here. You were never meant to." Jasmine didn't respond. Not yet. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't rise to the bait. Her face remained unreadable, frozen in the kind of stillness that only forms when rage is being strangled into focus. But her eyes, they shifted. Slowly, surgically, they locked onto Johnson like a sniper adjusting for wind. What he mistook for silence was coiling. What he mistook for defeat was ignition. The lights from the cameras reflected in her pupils like the shimmer of steel. And for a split second, the smirk on Johnson's face faltered. Not much, but enough to notice. Around the chamber, Democrats shifted uncomfortably, caught between procedural protocol and the desire to intervene. A few of them whispered to staffers, others stared straight ahead, knowing this was not just a hearing, it was a power play. Johnson wasn't arguing policy, he was establishing territory, and Jasmine had been marked for humiliation from the moment she walked through the door. She was the only black woman at the table, the only one seated near the back, the only one whose mic had to be manually adjusted when she sat down. It wasn't coincidence. It was choreography. Johnson leaned forward now, voice syrupy with faux courtesy. If the gentlewoman insists on continuing, I suggest she stay within the bounds of parliamentary relevance, and please spare us the melodrama. The way he said melodrama sliced through the air like a blade dipped in condescension. This was no longer politics. It was public shaming. The camera panned slowly across the panel, catching every expression. Smug indifference on one side, restrained fury on the other. Johnson's gaze never left her. He was waiting for her to crack, to lash out, to make his narrative complete. But Jasmine Crockett did not take the bait. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in precision. The corner of her mouth twitched, not into a smile, but something colder. Her hand, still resting on the folder, flexed once, then again. She was measuring the temperature of the room, counting the seconds, watching the rhythm of Johnson's performance like a boxer watching an opponent's footwork before the punch. This wasn't her defeat. It was his mistake. The trap had been sprung. He just didn't know yet. And as the camera zoomed closer to her face, what the nation saw wasn't humiliation. It was calculation. A storm was coming. They had tried to drown her in ridicule, hoping she'd either lash out or fade into silence. But Jasmine Crockett did neither. What she delivered instead was a scalpel to the heart of power. The chamber was so still, you could hear the hum of the ceiling lights. All eyes turned to her. Even those who had mocked her just moments earlier now leaned forward, compelled by something they didn't expect. Stillness, poise, control. Jasmine didn't touch her notes. Her hands were clasped in front of her, like she was holding something sacred. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. Not quiet, but restrained, like a fuse not yet lit. I'm not here to entertain anyone, she said, enunciating each syllable with a deliberate calm that made her words feel heavier than if she'd shouted them. I am not here to play a role in someone else's performance. I am here to confront a sickness that's been growing in this room, quietly, comfortably, behind closed doors and hidden footnotes. She paused, not because she needed to, because they did. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick with tension, shame, defiance. I'm here, she continued, eyes scanning the panel slowly, to expose the men who've weaponized bureaucracy, who've buried millions under technicalities, and who've turned the law into a shield for their lies. Her words didn't rise in volume. They sank in like poison. It was the kind of calm that rattled because it didn't beg to be heard. It demanded to be felt. No theatrics, no dramatics, just truth, raw and sharp, laid bare under the same fluorescent lights that had once been aimed at her like interrogation beams. Across the table, some shifted in their seats. A Republican aide stopped typing. One congressman furrowed his brow, as if trying to decide whether to speak or keep his head down. Johnson didn't move. His face froze into something between disdain and unease. And that was the tell. Just a twitch at the edge of his lip, a flicker of awareness that maybe he had misjudged the woman at the end of the table. Jasmine didn't need applause. She didn't need allies in that moment. All she needed was what she already carried, clarity and the nerve to use it like a weapon. And for the first time since the hearing began, it wasn't Johnson who controlled the room. It was her. Her statement had shifted the room's gravity. But just as the silence threatened to turn into accountability, Johnson snapped the moment back, weaponizing mockery like a man clinging to control. Mike Johnson didn't respond with logic. He didn't counter her with facts or rebut her with policy. Instead, he leaned back with the smug posture of someone who believed authority was armor. A faint, scoffing laugh escaped him, cold, rehearsed, and meant for the cameras. If the gentlewoman has evidence, he said, dragging the word gentlewoman like it was a costume that didn't fit her, then I encourage her to present it. The rest of us came here to discuss federal policy, not conspiracy fiction. He paused, scanning the room, gauging the weight of his own words, letting them hang like smoke. Though between us, he added, now leaning slightly toward his mic, I sincerely doubt she even knows what the budget appendix actually is, let alone how to read one. The slight tremble of forced amusement in his voice betrayed the real motive. Not defense, but dominance. Not disagreement, but dismissal. It wasn't just that he questioned her data, he questioned her intellect, her credibility, her right to even sit at the table. A few low chuckles fluttered across his side of the aisle, the kind of sound that confirms permission has been granted to condescend. Johnson didn't stop. He raised his eyebrows slightly, as if addressing a student in need of correction. Let's not pretend that grandstanding and social media theatrics substitute for understanding the federal ledger, he said. We're dealing with real numbers here, not sound bites. The jab was transparent and deliberate. He wasn't debating a colleague. He was publicly reducing her to a caricature, a loud voice, an empty folder, a face for the algorithm. It was the kind of insult that didn't come from policy disagreements, but from a deeper place, where power defends itself not by argument, but by erasure. And in that moment, surrounded by suits and silence, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just being challenged. She was being tested in front of the nation, under the full weight of a system that had never expected her to speak, much less strike back. He had mocked her command of numbers, scoffed at her understanding of procedure. But Jasmine Crockett didn't come armed with rhetoric. She came armed with receipts. Jasmine didn't speak right away. She let the weight of his insult settle, let the smugness linger just long enough to sharpen the contrast. Then, without theatrics, she reached for the folder in front of her. Her fingers moved deliberately, not rushed, not nervous, like someone setting the final piece in place. She slid a document onto the table and tapped twice. Behind her, the tech assistant responded instantly. The room dimmed slightly as the screen at the front of the chamber came to life. Not with an opinion, not with a speech, but with hard, unrelenting data. Government seal, time-stamped, verified by the Office of the Inspector General. And across the screen, rows of transactions spilled out in quiet devastation. Jasmine spoke evenly, almost too calmly. This document is a financial audit conducted by the OIG. It outlines a pattern of disbursements totaling $93 million, all routed through expedited infrastructure funds under Section 17B, funds that, on paper, were meant for emergency response. The screen scrolled. 3 names appeared, each tied to companies with nondescript titles and no public-facing operations. Each company had appeared only once on a federal contract, and all 3, as the audit showed, shared direct ties to a single individual. Grant Holland. Mr. Holland, Jasmine continued, still staring forward, has been a campaign strategist, private consultant, and personal friend to Speaker Johnson for over a decade. These companies list him as either executive officer or major shareholder. In all 3 cases, the funds arrived within 10 days of his meetings with the Speaker's office. The room had turned to stone. Republicans, moments earlier full of laughter and posture, now sat motionless. One congressman rubbed his temple. Another shuffled papers just to avoid looking up. The air itself had changed. Less oxygen, more pressure. Johnson didn't interrupt. He couldn't. His expression hadn't changed much, but the tell was there. One twitch in the corner of his jaw, one blink too slow. Jasmine let the moment breathe. The contracts were hidden in an appendix most members never reviewed. No bidding process, no oversight, just signatures. His, she said, tapping the document again, and silence. Then she turned her gaze directly to him. I may not have a long title, but I read every line they thought I'd skip. Her tone never wavered. She didn't need volume. She had something better. Evidence that didn't blink, didn't lie, didn't flinch. And as the numbers continued scrolling across the screen like a silent indictment, it was no longer Jasmine Crockett who had to prove herself. It was Mike Johnson who couldn't afford to speak. The evidence had struck like a hammer, clean, cold, indisputable. But when truth cornered power, it didn't surrender. It roared. Mike Johnson lurched forward in his seat, his composure shattering in real time. Gone was the calm, collected statesman from earlier. In his place stood a man exposed, scrambling to cloak vulnerability and volume. His voice rose suddenly, startlingly loud, slicing through the silence like a blade. "You are disgracing this chamber," he shouted, the words ricocheting off the marble walls. "Not to persuade, but to overwhelm. What you've brought forward is not oversight. It's an assault on the integrity of this institution. It's reckless. It's fabricated. It's beneath the dignity of Congress." His hand slammed against the desk for emphasis, though it trembled slightly, betraying the fury's foundation: fear. "This is nothing more than a political stunt," he continued, gesturing wildly toward the screen. "An attempt to smear reputations with loosely connected figures and cherry-pick contracts." There was desperation in his rhythm now. He wasn't rebutting a claim. He was trying to drown it. His gaze locked on Jasmine like a man trying to intimidate his way out of an indictment. "You are turning this hall into a theater of lies, Congresswoman. You are manipulating numbers you clearly don't understand to push a false narrative, to poison this chamber with conspiracy and ego." His voice cracked slightly. Barely, but it did. And for a brief moment, the mask slipped. This wasn't strength. It was the panic of a man who realized the room no longer belonged to him. The walls weren't listening out of respect anymore. They were waiting to hear what she would say next. Johnson's voice had just filled the chamber with indignation, but Jasmine Crockett didn't meet fire with fire. She met it with something far more dangerous: the truth, timed like a blade. Jasmine didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice or strike with dramatics. Instead, she let the silence stretch, long enough for the adrenaline in the room to turn inward, for every gaze to refocus on her. And then, in a tone so even it felt almost surgical, she asked, "If this is all just conjecture, Mr. Speaker, then why did you sign off on those transfers without any audit documentation on file?" Her voice wasn't accusatory. It was worse. It was exact, calculated, impossible to twist. The question didn't call for debate. It called for reckoning. The kind of reckoning a man isn't prepared for when he spent too long speaking from a pedestal instead of answering from the floor. The temperature in the room dropped by degrees. Staffers glanced at one another. Members froze mid-note. The screen behind her still displayed the damning flow of funds, but now all attention had shifted to his reaction. Johnson opened his mouth, but the words didn't come immediately. For 5 long seconds, the Speaker of the House, a man accustomed to commanding headlines and holding gavels like weapons, sat speechless. Not thoughtful, not patient. Just caught. Finally, with a voice that had lost its edge, he muttered, "Because I trust my technical staff." But the moment he said it, he knew he'd miscalculated. It was a placeholder response. Vague, institutional, a line from the oldest page in the political survival playbook. And it wasn't enough. Not this time. Jasmine was already turning the next page. "That's interesting," she said, her voice still calm but now touched with something sharper. "Because according to this memo," she held up a crisp, single-page document, "you didn't just authorize the transfer. You wrote the instruction by hand. Right here." She stepped forward slightly and handed the page to the clerk, who passed it up to the dais. Cameras zoomed in on it almost immediately. At the top, the Speaker's letterhead. In the center, a single paragraph, short and direct. At the bottom, his unmistakable signature, dated and accompanied by a brief handwritten note. "Proceed immediately. Do not delay with formal review." The clerk hadn't even finished placing the page before gasps echoed quietly through the chamber. There was no ambiguity, no plausible deniability. This wasn't buried in a stack of anonymous approvals. It was personal. It was direct. It was damning. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. Her face remained composed, not out of detachment, but out of control. Complete, steady control. "This note bypassed standard oversight protocol," she said, eyes never leaving Johnson. "It was issued prior to any supporting documentation from the subcommittees, and it overrode internal cautionary flags from your own compliance unit. So let me ask again, was this the work of your technical staff, or was this your decision? Her tone never broke. It didn't need to. The room was already collapsing into her rhythm. One Republican congressman glanced at the document and quickly looked away. Another pressed his lips together and folded his arms, the reflex of a man retreating inward. Johnson stared at the paper now, but he didn't touch it. He didn't blink. For all his previous bravado, for all the noise he had brought into the room, he now found himself trapped in a moment he couldn't shout his way out of. Every camera was fixed on his face. Every journalist in the press gallery had leaned forward. They weren't recording a debate anymore. They were witnessing a reckoning. Jasmine stepped back into her seat slowly, without turning away from him. "You challenged my understanding of the appendix," she said softly. "But I read it. Every word, every footnote, every buried clause. And while you were counting on no one else to notice, I kept going." There was no triumph in her voice, just a steady, unflinching declaration of truth. "You underestimated what happens when someone actually pays attention." And in that moment, for the first time during the hearing, it wasn't Jasmine Crockett who looked like the outsider. It was Mike Johnson, isolated, exposed, and sitting beneath a truth he could no longer control. The signature had shaken the floor beneath him, but Jasmine knew paper alone wouldn't be enough. So she gave the room something they couldn't deny. She gave them his voice. There was a beat of stillness after the document, a lull, a breath. And in that fragile silence, Jasmine reached forward with quiet finality and tapped the small black device at her side. The overhead monitor shifted. Gone were the spreadsheets, the memos, the audit logs. In their place, a glowing waveform pulsed against a black background. No music, no introduction, just static for half a second. Then a voice, male, calm, measured, and unmistakably Mike Johnson. "The public doesn't need the details," he said in a tone so casual it sounded like small talk over coffee. But in the chamber, the effect was nuclear. "They're too busy trying to pay off student loans and gas bills to care where the money goes. We tuck it into line items. Nobody asks. Nobody reads." The words hit like shrapnel. Not metaphor, not accusation, but confession. And it wasn't paraphrased. It was his voice, unfiltered, undeniable, like a ghost rising from behind his polished podium to haunt the room that once clapped for him. There was no explosion at first, just a strange, sharp stillness, like everyone was trying to confirm they'd actually heard what they thought they did. Then it broke. Audible gasps, sharp intakes of breath. A Democratic representative, seated 2 rows from Johnson, whispered, "Jesus," under her breath. Another leaned toward her staffer, hand over mouth. But Jasmine said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was a spotlight. The voice kept going, slow and damning. "We don't need them to understand it. We just need them to forget it." That was when the room truly cracked open. Phones came out, not from the public gallery, but from lawmakers, Democrats, independents, even 2 Republicans who couldn't stop their instincts. They weren't just documenting a scandal. They were preserving evidence. Because what was playing wasn't an opinion. It was strategy, not negligence, intent. The kind of behind-closed-doors calculation that millions of Americans had long suspected, but never thought they'd hear out loud. And here it was, broadcast through the marble and wood echo chamber of Congress, in the speaker's own voice. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her arms stayed at her sides. Her face was unreadable. But her eyes never left Johnson, and his never left the screen. For the first time all day, his hands weren't moving. His jaw wasn't working. His spine had straightened, as if a chill had gone through it. Because in that moment, he wasn't just being accused. He was being played back, his own words like a mirror he could no longer smash. In the gallery above, a reporter dropped their pen. Another muttered into a recorder, voice shaking. The hearing had become something else entirely. Not inquiry, not oversight, but rupture. The fragile contract between those in power and those watching had been torn in real time. "They won't read the appendix," Johnson's recorded voice continued. "They never do." That's the point. That line drew an audible reaction. A few Republicans whispered between themselves. Some leaned back, visibly uncomfortable. Others sat frozen, eyes wide, waiting for someone to intervene, anyone to stop the bleeding. But Jasmine didn't press pause. She let the full 23 seconds play uninterrupted. And when it ended, the silence was not just thick, it was suffocating. No rebuttal, no talking points, just the aftershock of clarity. She didn't have to explain the tape. It explained itself. She stepped toward the microphone, not with aggression but gravity. Her words when she spoke were few, steady, devastating. "This isn't about miscommunication," she said. "It's about manipulation. Calculated, admitted, and now recorded." There was nothing else to say. And for the first time in the entire hearing, Mike Johnson had nothing left to hide behind. Not title, not process, not denial, just silence, his own. The chamber was still echoing with the weight of Johnson's own voice. But before accountability could settle, the machinery of power did what it always does. It tried to buy time. The first motion came with manufactured calm, but the urgency beneath it was impossible to miss. Congressman Rhodes, a longtime Johnson ally, adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and spoke into the mic with the controlled cadence of a man rehearsing damage control. "Mr. Chairman," he said, voice slightly hoarse, "given the nature of the material just introduced and the need to ensure procedural fairness, I formally request that we recess this hearing until the veracity of the audio can be independently reviewed." The words dripped with legal caution, but everyone in the room knew what it really meant. Retreat, delay, hope the headlines fade. Another Republican, Congresswoman Laird, followed immediately, her voice tight and eyes darting between reporters in the gallery. "This is a serious accusation," she added. "We should not be proceeding under the shadow of unverified recordings." Their expressions masked it poorly. This wasn't skepticism. It was self-preservation, thinly veiled by formality. The chamber stirred. Aides whispered into earpieces. Some members leaned back, clearly relieved by the suggestion of a procedural lifeline. The pressure in the room had become unbearable, and this motion was the escape hatch. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to let them crawl through it. She stood, calm, steady, but immovable. And with a voice that didn't rise in anger, but in absolute clarity, she said, "No, just that. No procedural jargon. No stalling. Just a line in the sand." Then she turned slowly to face the committee. Her words followed like a gavel slamming shut. "Today the American people are watching, not tomorrow. Not after a weekend of talking points and press releases. Now." Her voice didn't need to be loud. It was the only thing in the room that didn't tremble. "We are not going to pause the truth because it makes some of you uncomfortable. We are not going to bury this under a pile of subpoenas and subcommittee referrals." She took a breath, not for drama, but for precision. "I will not yield. Not when the highest office in this House is implicated. Not when corruption hides behind bureaucracy. Not when millions of Americans outside these walls have been told again and again that no one listens." The room had gone still again, but not with fear this time. With reckoning. She wasn't arguing anymore. She was refusing to move. And in that refusal, the hearing didn't pause. It escalated. The room had tried to catch its breath, but Jasmine Crockett had no intention of letting it. What she delivered next wasn't another accusation. It was confirmation. She reached for a second folder, thicker, darker, sealed with a red paperclip, and the room, already on edge, went still again. There was no buildup this time, no preamble, just a quiet click as Jasmine snapped the folder open and slid 4 printed pages across the table. With a nod to the technician, the documents appeared on the screen one by one, each bearing the header of the Office of the Speaker. Official timestamps, internal routing, all authentic. "These," she began, her voice calm but cutting, "are internal communications from the Speaker's own office. Not rumors, not second-hand speculation. Direct messages between senior staff coordinating financial reallocation through undisclosed third parties." The first email projected clearly, its subject line reading, "Vendor diversion confirmation, keep external." The text beneath it was worse. Move total via Grant's vehicle. Avoid naming until Q3. Use legacy PAC format if questioned. Jasmine looked up. This is not oversight. This is a map, a deliberate trail. No one interrupted. She moved to the second email, her tone still composed. Here, we see planning. Coordinate Shell invoices with Holland before disclosure deadline. Confirm Johnson's sign-off. She let it hang. This is from his deputy. That sign-off isn't hypothetical. It's written, it's dated, and it matches the document we've already submitted to this hearing. The screen flipped to email 3. A budget flowchart titled Channel Masking Options, Compliant Presentation. Jasmine pointed to one line that read, Split into 3 firms to avoid thresholds. Rotate signatories. The words weren't flashy. They were cold, technical, real. The kind of language not meant to be heard outside closed doors. And finally, she said, clicking the last tab, confirmation. On screen, the final email revealed itself. No euphemisms, no vague planning. Just a blunt message from a staffer to Johnson's deputy. Speaker approved. Proceed. Same structure as February. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The documents did the screaming for her. These aren't miscommunications, she said. They're instructions. This wasn't just a misuse of funds. It was political laundering, hidden under bureaucratic camouflage, protected by the power of his title. Around her, silence. The kind that only comes when people realize what they're hearing isn't just serious, it's historic. Johnson didn't speak, couldn't. He had gone from authority figure to liability in under 3 minutes. And Jasmine Crockett, standing firm, hadn't blinked once. 4 emails had just ripped the mask off the institution. And in the silence that followed, Mike Johnson did the only thing a man cornered by truth knows how to do. He exploded. The weight of Jasmine's evidence had settled like a storm cloud inside the chamber. Thick, inescapable, electric. But rather than confront the reality of what had been laid bare, Mike Johnson snapped. He slammed his palm against the polished oak desk so hard the microphones clipped, and several aides flinched in unison. The sound cracked across the room like a gunshot, but what followed was louder. Who the hell gave you permission to bring this garbage in here? He shouted, voice raw and rising, his composure finally fractured beyond repair. This is Congress, not a stage for whatever political drama you think you're starring in. Spittle flashed at the edge of his words as his finger jabbed the air in her direction. We are lawmakers, not audience members in your little show. His face had turned crimson, jaw clenched, veins flaring along his temple. The polished image he'd spent a career constructing had shattered, and all that was left behind was a man raging against his own unraveling. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't flinch, didn't backpedal, didn't blink. Instead, as the Speaker of the House stood red-faced and fuming, she tilted her head ever so slightly and smiled. It wasn't smug, it wasn't sarcastic. It was worse, it was knowing. Her smile didn't mock his anger, it dissected it. If you think truth is garbage, she said quietly, calmly, then maybe you've never written a real law. You've only bought time, borrowed it, really, before the weight of your lies brings the whole thing down. She delivered the words like a surgeon. No wasted motion, no wasted air. They weren't loud. They were lethal. The chamber didn't breathe. The fury in Johnson's face gave way to something else. Confusion, then disbelief, then something close to fear. He hadn't expected her to strike so precisely, to meet his volume with stillness, to strip him bare with one sentence. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was devastating. For a moment he looked like he wanted to speak again, to bark, to push back. But he couldn't find the words. His hand, still hovering above the table, slowly dropped. And just like that, the speaker, the man who had tried to drown her in insult, in protocol, in raw intimidation, was silenced by the very force he tried to diminish. Jasmine didn't gloat. She turned her eyes away from him and back to the rest of the chamber. Her voice never changed pitch. This isn't a performance, she said, speaking now to the entire room. This is accountability, something too many people in this building think they're entitled to avoid. Her gaze passed over members who had whispered and shifted all morning, daring them to meet her stare. You want to talk about dignity, about the honor of this institution? Then maybe it's time we stop protecting the powerful and start protecting the people who trusted us with this seat in the first place. She pointed not to Johnson, but to the documents still glowing on the screen behind her. That's not theater. That's evidence. Johnson sank back into his chair like something in his body had given way. His fury had failed. His voice had cracked. And the room had shifted. Reporters in the gallery typed without looking down. A few aides near the rear stepped out to take phone calls with panicked urgency. Jasmine remained standing, her hands at her sides, unshaking. The room wasn't hers by title, but at that moment it belonged to her in every way that mattered. She had exposed him, stripped away his protection, and turned his outrage into the very proof of his weakness. And all she had to do was speak. Just speak, clearly, calmly, and with more courage than the building around her had seen in years. The speaker's voice had collapsed into silence, but the walls weren't done listening. The room had changed, and in that shift, someone else rose, not with rage, but with resolve. From the far left bench, Representative Caleb Rose stood, not slowly, not cautiously, but with the kind of stillness that commands immediate attention. Known for his refusal to play party politics and for a voting record that rarely bent to either side, Rowe was not a man who spoke unless he had measured every syllable. His eyes didn't wander. He didn't scan the room for permission. He looked straight ahead, voice calm, unflinching, and said, "Mr. Chairman, I am formally calling for an immediate ethics investigation into the conduct of Speaker Mike Johnson." The words were steady, but they landed like thunder. There was no flourish, no theater, only the raw simplicity of truth meeting its next step, accountability. His voice did not tremble, it did not rise, but it shook the chamber in ways 1,000 gavel strikes never could. Around him, heads turned, staffers paused mid-keystroke. Even some Republican members who had been quietly bracing for damage control looked away, the weight of that sentence pressing down like gravity. For a second, just one, the room forgot how to move. Then came the sound of urgency, a chorus of clicks, rapid-fire tapping from the press gallery above, as headlines erupted across screens like sparks catching dry grass. Breaking, independent rep calls for ethics probe into House Speaker Johnson. Another followed seconds later. Crockett delivers blow, so devastating it silences the Speaker of the House. Reporters scrambled to push updates live. Phones buzzed with notifications before the committee's microphones even went quiet. But the story didn't need embellishment. Jasmine's voice had carried the facts. The emails had carried the proof. And Johnson's silence was carrying the guilt. He didn't speak. He didn't rise to object. Didn't lean into the mic. Didn't even lift his chin. His right hand, once clenched into a fist just minutes ago, now lay flat against the desk, open, motionless, the color drained from his knuckles. His posture had collapsed inward, spine no longer rigid with pride, but curved beneath the invisible weight of exposure. The man who had moments earlier thundered about garbage and grandstanding now stared blankly at the wood grain in front of him, as if hoping it would swallow him whole. His silence wasn't strategic. It was survival, a final refuge from the reality unraveling in real time. And Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice or flash the smile of victory. She remained seated, poised, her face carved in solemn defiance. Her hands rested gently on the folder she had just closed, its contents now echoing across the internet, television, and the consciousness of every person tuned in. She looked to Representative Rowe and nodded once, a silent affirmation between truth-tellers. Then she turned back to the committee, not to demand, not to plead, but to affirm what had already become clear. "I second the motion for an immediate investigation," she said, her tone calm, surgical, and final. "And I request that it begin without delay." No one spoke, because there was nothing left to argue. Behind her, the screen still glowed, casting a pale light across the stunned faces of the chamber. The emails, the audio, the signatures. It was all there. Undeniable. The evidence had spoken, the nation had heard it, and the speaker had nothing left to say. He didn't shake his head. He didn't reach for a rebuttal. He simply sat there, eyes down, posture slumped, not in contemplation, but collapse. His authority hadn't just been questioned, it had been hollowed out in full public view. It wasn't just a political defeat, it was a reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett, who had entered that hearing, buried at the end of the table, now sat at the epicenter of a shift no one could stop. The headlines kept rolling. Social media exploded. Cable news broke into coverage. But inside the room, the silence endured. Not awkward, not procedural. Historic. Because for the first time, possibly in his entire political career, Mike Johnson had no response. No spin, no script. Just the truth, printed in black and white, replayed in his own voice, and repeated in the eyes of everyone who now knew. He was finished, and the room knew it. The chamber had gone still. The speaker had gone silent. And in that paralyzed moment, a new name for what had just unfolded began spreading across airwaves and newsrooms like wildfire. They didn't call it a scandal. They didn't call it a hearing. They didn't even call it an exposé. By the time the footage finished airing live, by the time millions had rewatched Jasmine Crockett's final words and Mike Johnson's final silence, there was only one phrase echoing through every newsroom, trending across every platform, whispered like a verdict across political war rooms: the Capitol collapse. Not because the building had fallen, but because something far more terrifying had. The illusion of control, the myth of untouchability, the veneer of power that Johnson had spent years reinforcing with polished speeches, strategic alliances, and an empire of procedural armor had crumbled under the sheer weight of evidence and one woman's refusal to flinch. It didn't explode, it imploded. Quietly, methodically, devastatingly. News anchors delivered the phrase with a reverence normally reserved for historical tragedy. "What we've witnessed today," one said, her voice trembling just beneath the professional cadence, "is not just a political embarrassment, it's a structural breach in American legislative credibility." Another cut in live from Capitol Hill, a storm of flashing cameras behind him. "They're calling it the Capitol collapse. And make no mistake, this wasn't about drama. This was about documents, about evidence, about silence where there should have been denial." Every major outlet ran the same image side by side. Jasmine standing upright, composed, eyes forward, and Johnson hunched, silent, shadowed in defeat. On the Chiron, the collapse begins, truth versus power. For those watching from home, the moment felt surreal, like watching the end of something that was never supposed to end. How often does a Speaker of the House go speechless on live television? How often does a junior congresswoman from Texas unravel an empire in under 90 minutes? And yet, that's exactly what had happened. Not with shouting, not with partisanship, but with cold, damning receipts and a voice that refused to shake. Viewers didn't just see a scandal, they felt a shift. The kind that doesn't get erased with spin or delayed with process. The kind that cracks the floorboards under the seat of power and dares the whole institution to keep pretending it's stable. Inside the Capitol itself, the ripple effect was immediate. Doors closed faster. Staffers who once held swagger moved in silence. Faces taut, phones pressed to ears as if information might keep them afloat. Committee rooms went dark. Internal chats buzzed with warnings. Say nothing. Let comms handle it. Wait for leadership. But leadership had fallen quiet. Because when the most powerful man in the chamber lowers his head and fails to respond, not out of strategy, but because he's been stripped bare, there is no one left to answer the call. And Jasmine, she walked out without ceremony. No cameras followed her down the hall, not right away. She didn't wave, didn't stop for a statement. She didn't have to. Her words were already replaying on every major outlet in the country, etched into the collective memory of a political system used to swallowing stories like this before they ever see daylight. But this one had burned its way through every layer, not because it was sensational, but because it was true. Because in a town built on denial, she had done something dangerous. She had made truth undeniable. Some tried to downplay it. Talk radio spun phrases like coordinated ambush and optics over accuracy. But their words rang hollow in the shadow of the footage. The emails, the recordings, the speaker's own voice. What Jasmine exposed wasn't just corruption, it was design, intent, the architecture of a system that had assumed no one would look hard enough to see its cracks, until someone finally did. And when they did, the system didn't push back. It buckled. That's why they called it the Capitol collapse. Because buildings don't fall when they're shaken from outside. They fall when the rot inside becomes too deep to carry the weight. And on that day, under fluorescent lights and the hum of live feeds, the rot finally surfaced. It had a name. It had a signature. It had a voice. And it had no defense. Only silence. The kind that follows a reckoning. The kind that rewrites everything. The kind that even power can't interrupt. The Capitol collapse didn't end when Jasmine Crockett left the room. It detonated outward. And within hours, pressure began rising like a tide too powerful to hold back. By sunset, the walls of power weren't just trembling, they were being battered from the outside in. What began as murmurs turned into a roar. National organizations, watchdog coalitions, and bipartisan advocacy groups flooded the airwaves. Their messages coordinated not by party but by principle. The Government Integrity Project issued a formal letter to Congress. Speaker Johnson has lost the moral and procedural authority to lead this House. We demand his immediate resignation. The American Voters Trust launched an online petition within the hour. 500,000 signatures poured in before midnight. Headlines grew sharper, no longer asking if he should step down, but when. On CNN, Crockett's evidence sparks national outcry. Groups demand Speaker's ouster. On MSNBC, moral authority shattered, calls for Johnson's resignation multiply. Even conservative outlets couldn't ignore the fracture. A grim headline from a once friendly editorial board read, "Is this the end of the Johnson era?" The calls weren't just coming from the usual voices. Veterans associations expressed outrage at discretionary funds being misused while military housing remained underfunded. Civic tech groups dissected every email Jasmine had released, annotating the details line by line and releasing them to the public with infographics so damning they went viral in under 20 minutes. On social media, hashtags like Step Down Johnson, Speaker Exposed, and Crockett Truth dominated trends across platforms. Prominent figures, former lawmakers, constitutional scholars, even retired judges went on record. This isn't a partisan matter. It's a constitutional crisis. The Speaker's position is untenable. And through it all, Johnson said nothing. No tweet, no press statement, no emergency appearance. His silence became its own scandal, a void where leadership should have stood, replaced by spineless inertia. Former allies began to distance themselves, quietly at first. By the next morning, it turned to public fracture. Congressman Eldridge, a senior Republican and longtime supporter, released a statement. The integrity of this chamber must come before loyalty to any one individual. I support an independent investigation and believe Speaker Johnson should consider stepping aside. Moments later, 2 committee chairs followed suit. It wasn't just about damage control anymore. It was about survival for everyone who had once stood beside him. Outside the Capitol, protesters gathered, organically, relentlessly. Students, teachers, healthcare workers, not in the tens, in the thousands. They held signs quoting Jasmine's words verbatim, "Truth is not garbage." We read what they hoped we'd ignore. The steps of the Capitol filled with voices that echoed the very indictment she had delivered inside. It didn't matter that it wasn't an election year. It didn't matter that she wasn't a committee chair or a party leader. What mattered was that someone had finally stood up and stripped power bare, and the country saw it happen in real time. Johnson's team scrambled behind closed doors, legal advisors, media consultants, damage control strategists, but none of them could put the walls back up, not after Jasmine had taken them apart brick by documented brick. Reporters hounded hallways for statements, his staff dodged cameras, and still no words came, because there was no script left to follow, only consequences, and one echo growing louder every hour. Resign, resign, resign. This wasn't a storm he could ride out. It was the reckoning no one believed would ever come, until it did. And by the time night fell over Washington, D.C., the Speaker of the House no longer looked like a leader. He looked like a man out of moves, out of time, out of power. As the calls for resignation mounted and Johnson's silence turned to political suffocation, the focus of a fractured nation shifted toward the woman who had faced a machine and didn't blink. In less than 12 hours, Jasmine Crockett went from being a rising but often sidelined voice in Congress to the most searched, watched, and talked about individual in the United States. Her name wasn't just on the news ticker, it was the news. On Google, it skyrocketed past every celebrity, athlete, and public figure, hitting #1 in trending searches by early morning and holding firm for the next 24 hours. News outlets couldn't keep up. Who is Jasmine Crockett? Flooded headlines from the New York Times to BuzzFeed to international media in Europe and Asia. CNN opened their 9 a.m. broadcast with a full 5-minute monologue. From oversight to overhaul, how one Congresswoman redefined accountability. On The View, co-hosts replayed her now iconic quote, "If you think truth is garbage, you've never written a real law." And the audience erupted in applause. Clips of her final words to Johnson were spliced with triumphant music, slowed down for effect, captioned and subtitled for virality. The entire country, it seemed, couldn't stop watching the moment power met its match. Yet this sudden spotlight wasn't just fascination, it was hunger. Americans exhausted by years of deflection, gridlock, and scandals buried beneath legalese were witnessing something they didn't expect: clarity. Jasmine hadn't outshouted her opponent. She had outworked him. She didn't posture. She prepared. And that preparation, the folders, the emails, the audio, the surgical tempo, made her impossible to ignore. Her quiet fury, her steadiness in the face of shouting, wasn't performative. It was justice distilled into flesh and blood. And the people saw it. They didn't just cheer her. They trusted her. That was what made the impact seismic. Not popularity, credibility, not charisma, conviction. By mid-afternoon, universities were hosting emergency panels. Law professors dissected her cross-examination style, drawing comparisons to Thurgood Marshall, to Barbara Jordan. On TikTok, Gen Z creators put her face alongside historic reformers. "She's not just trending," one user posted over a video montage. "She's rewriting what courage in Congress looks like." On Instagram, artists began sketching her face over illustrations of broken gavels and burning red tape. The aesthetic was immediate. The symbolism was undeniable. A woman of color who had been dismissed, doubted, sidelined, and mocked, who had the courage to stare down the most powerful man in the chamber and expose him with nothing but documentation and composure, had become a movement. And what made it all the more gripping was what came before. Because the country remembered. They remembered how she'd been talked over, how she'd been called a TikTok congresswoman, how her intelligence had been questioned on a national stage, how the speaker had raised his voice and slammed the table while she never once lost her calm. She had walked into that hearing at a disadvantage, surrounded by people who expected her to fold under pressure, and she walked out with the nation behind her. That kind of reversal doesn't come from a viral moment. It comes from undeniable merit breaking through the institutional fog. White House press correspondents were asked about her in the briefing room. Several sitting senators, usually hesitant to comment on House drama, tweeted their admiration. Civil rights groups, advocacy coalitions, and bipartisan watchdogs issued statements hailing her poise and demanding that more hearings be made as transparent as the one she had just led. Editorial boards that had never once published her name ran op-eds with titles like Jasmine Crockett and the Return of Congressional Courage. Her inbox was overwhelmed. Her staff, many of them young, underpaid, and underestimated, were suddenly at the center of a media vortex, trying to coordinate press requests from every major Sunday show while drafting ethics reform proposals requested by committee heads. And yet, as all this unfolded, this tidal wave of attention, validation, and cultural ascension, Jasmine didn't take a victory lap. She didn't rush to a press podium. She didn't change her tone. She didn't sell the moment. She let the truth breathe. She stayed grounded in the very thing that had carried her through that hearing: the facts. She reportedly declined 3 late-night show invitations that same day. Not because she wasn't grateful, but because, as one aide told the press, the Congresswoman didn't come here to be famous. She came here to work. She still is. But the people didn't stop watching. If anything, their attention intensified. For every headline that quoted her, there were 10 more replays of her face when Johnson fell silent. For every think piece about the fall of a speaker, there was another about the rise of a woman who had shown America what it looks like to dismantle injustice without raising your voice. And in that attention, something profound took root. She wasn't just the most searched name in America. She was the most believed. Because in a nation drowning in noise, Jasmine Crockett did the rarest thing imaginable. She made silence speak. And it echoed everywhere. As the headlines rolled in and the nation reckoned with what had unfolded, a deeper truth emerged, one not printed in documents or broadcast through microphones, but etched in the struggle of the woman who stood alone and never flinched. What Jasmine Crockett gave the country in that hearing wasn't just a masterclass in political accountability. It was a human lesson, brutal in clarity and beautiful in courage. She stood in a chamber designed to silence women like her. She walked into a room that saw her as ornamental, inconvenient, another name on a list, another seat to fill. She was underestimated, interrupted, and branded as performative before she even spoke a full sentence. And yet she didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead for respect. She earned it through patience, through preparation, through principle. That's what made the moment so unbearable for those in power. They hadn't just been exposed by facts. They had been undone by someone who refused to play by the rules they rigged. Jasmine proved that integrity is not loud, but unshakable. And when given the space to breathe, it doesn't just speak, it roars in silence. For every second she was mocked, she planted a seed. For every eye that rolled when she asked a question, she sharpened her response. The injustice she faced wasn't just about party or policy. It was the grinding, invisible wall that so many women, especially women of color, face in every arena of power. The smirks, the procedural cutoffs, the casual dismissals. She didn't rage against them. She made them irrelevant. That is the soul of the lesson. Real strength doesn't erupt. It endures. It studies. It waits. And when the moment comes, it reveals. Jasmine Crockett didn't just expose a speaker. She exposed a system, one small crack at a time, until the whole thing began to collapse under the weight of its own rot. And it wasn't just what she uncovered that mattered. It was how. She never made it about herself. She didn't cry victim. She didn't center emotion. She centered facts. She trusted that truth, when wielded with discipline and unshakable resolve, was enough. And it was. That's the most human lesson of all. When everything is stacked against you, when your voice is the smallest in the room, you don't have to scream to be heard. You have to stand. You have to believe in the merit of your cause more than they believe in the power of their position. And then, when they mock you, when they try to dismiss you, you answer with proof, with poise, with purpose. Millions watched Jasmine's composure, but too few saw the cost, the hours of preparation, the weight of carrying her community's expectations, the sting of being labeled angry when she was simply informed, the loneliness of being the only one at the table who knew she'd get no benefit of the doubt. And still, she came. She sat. She spoke. And through that, she gave voice to a generation that had started to wonder if truth could still win. She showed young girls that courage isn't about having power. It's about knowing when to hold the line even when you don't. She reminded veterans of justice movements that the fight was still alive. She proved to cynics that facts, when delivered without fear, still can break through noise. In the story of power, Jasmine Crockett taught us something unshakably human, that sometimes the most extraordinary thing a person can do is not back down, even when they're alone, especially when they're alone. And that lesson, once seen, can never be unseen. She walked alone into that chamber. She faced condescension, contempt, and concentrated silence. She gave us the truth. And now that we have it, the next step isn't hers to take. It's ours. What Jasmine Crockett did inside that hearing was extraordinary, but it should not have to be. It should not take a woman with a steel spine, buried under institutional indifference, to drag truth out of the shadows with a bloodless blade. It should not take 4 leaked emails, a handwritten signature, and a voice of unwavering calm to finally pull back the curtain on rot that has festered for years. But it did. And because it did, because she did what few dared, we owe it to her and to the truth she unearthed to ensure this moment does not pass like a storm we watch through glass. We owe her more than admiration. We owe her action. This is not the part of the story where we return to our distractions. This is not the part where we share a clip and move on. Because if this moment stops with retweets, if it dies beneath the next headline, then everything she endured inside that room was for nothing. The smirks, the interruptions, the open dismissal of her intelligence, the attempt to bury her under protocol and power. That wasn't just about her, it was about us. It was about the voices we silence when they don't speak with the right accent. It was about the facts we ignore when they come from someone the establishment never expected to speak at all. Jasmine Crockett cracked open that silence. She showed us what's hiding behind it. So what now? Now we organize? Now we remember that power only shifts when people refuse to sit still. Now we flood every office that stood silent during this hearing and ask, where were you when the speaker fell silent under evidence? Now we demand investigations that don't evaporate after a news cycle. Now we support ethics reform, not in theory, but in legislation. Now we tell every young woman who's been told to wait her turn that the turn is now. We write letters. We show up at town halls. We volunteer. We teach our children that integrity does not wear a suit, it wears scars, and it speaks anyway. And we protect the next Jasmine. Because the truth is, for every one woman who makes it through the wall, there are 100 others who never even get the mic turned on. For every name that trends, there are voices buried beneath procedure, dismissed as emotional, accused of ambition when all they ever wanted was accountability. We cannot celebrate Jasmine and ignore the barriers still standing behind her. We cannot lift her up as a moment and not as a warning. Because what she revealed in that hearing wasn't just the guilt of one man, it was the price we pay when we normalize looking away. And if we truly believe in what she stood for, we must hold that line. We must demand transparency not just when it's convenient, but when it's hard. We must fund local journalism, protect whistleblowers, elect people who don't just speak well, but listen fiercely. We must stop asking for perfection and start rewarding courage. We must be willing to be uncomfortable, because comfort is where corruption flourishes. Jasmine Crockett made us uncomfortable for all the right reasons. She reminded us that justice is rarely clean, that truth often arrives dressed in defiance, that reckoning doesn't wear a flag, it wears fire. This is not just about fixing one chamber or one party. It's about fixing our expectations. It's about breaking the habit of waiting for someone else to do the hard thing. Jasmine did her part. She walked into a room full of men who underestimated her, who called her names behind closed doors, who weaponized her poise against her. And she dismantled them not with emotion, but with evidence, with restraint, with fire forged in discipline. That's not just a political moment. That's a blueprint. That's a call. So answer it. Refuse to be quiet. Refuse to be distracted. Refuse to let this story fade into a footnote in someone else's memoir. Because history doesn't change when we admire bravery. It changes when we match it. Jasmine Crockett threw a stone into a very still, very dangerous pond. And the ripples have reached us all. Don't just ride the wave. Be the next one. Push the next truth. Break the next silence. And never ever let this be the last time power is forced to tremble before principle. And remember this, Jasmine Crockett didn't ask to become a symbol. She came to do her job, to ask the questions no one else would, to read what others skipped, to speak when the room begged her to stay quiet. That's what makes her victory so profound. It wasn't about theatrics. It was about duty, about discipline, about walking into the storm anyway. And if her courage taught us anything, it's that democracy doesn't survive on spectacle. It survives on people showing up, refusing to back down, and choosing truth over comfort. So don't just remember her name, honor her example. Speak when it's hard, stand when it's lonely, and never again let anyone mistake silence for strength. Because in a room designed to break her, Jasmine Crockett stood tall, and the entire country rose with her. Now it's your turn. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.